I know that you focused your research specifically on DMT, dimethyltryptamine, which I understand is potentially the most powerful psychedelic that we know of. But apart from that, what is it to you that is distinctive and interesting about this molecule?
Well, I think the most interesting thing about DMT, apart from the intensity of the experience, which, as I said earlier, can make atheists non-atheists in 10 minutes, is that it's naturally occurring not just in various plants, but also in pretty much all mammals, as far as we know, including humans. So here we have a psychedelic agent which is naturally occurring in the human body, and we don't know necessarily what the function of that is, although there's been a lot of speculation, or even where it's produced, for that matter. But it is potentially a jigsaw piece in the puzzle of how spontaneous mystical and transpersonal experiences and parapsychological experiences arise. It could be that, endogenous DMT that's made in the body could be part of the equation of how spontaneous experiences occur. And so that, for me, is probably one of the main reasons for studying it. But also, and I think it's probably because it is endogenous, it also has these extremely profound effects on people. Life-changing, kind of worldview changing, kind of atheist changing effects.
So, as you know, one of the very common experiences during psychedelics, and especially DMT, though, are these very convincing encounters with apparent intelligences, which seem to be originating from outside of us somehow. They seem very other to us, and yet I know that you're open to the idea, among other possibilities, that these experiences could be legitimate encounters with other beings, other minds, potentially inhabiting different frames of reality on some level. So, what is it that makes that a plausible idea for you?
Well, it's something that people tend to come away from the experience thinking, People go into a DMT experience maybe not really knowing what to expect, or maybe having read some stuff, but you can't really prepare somebody for a DMT experience because it's beyond our realm of understanding, in the ordinary state of consciousness. So people are genuinely kind of deeply surprised and kind of somewhat awestruck by the intensity of the experience. And encounters with seemingly sentient other beings occurs pretty frequently at high doses. And of course, one of the things about the DMT experience is it seemed more real than waking reality. If you had to kind of hedge your ontological bets on which reality was more real, most people would put it on the DMT experience, and hence it is kind of profoundly worldview changing capacities. So the experience alone leads people to accept the experiences often at face value, that they really did encounter otherworldly beings that exist in some other kind of disincarnate realm or some such. Aside from that, so we shouldn't necessarily just dismiss people's experiences because they're subjective. But also, one of the other features is that there's a high degree of correspondence between people's experiences, perhaps even naively. So that, for instance, there are certain characters which seem to pop up with alarming recurrency, like the little people, for instance. So, the experience of encounters with dwarves, elves, pixies, gnomes, whatever you want to call them, little people, seems to occur quite a lot. And we also know that these experiences were relatively common pre the discovery of DMT. People would spontaneously have encounters with little people, we know from folklore the world over. So that's an intriguing experience, as are some other kind of more obscure kind of characters, such as praying mantises, typically conducting, like usually huge praying mantises towering over the person, conducting kind of brain surgery on people and kind of rearranging their kind of neural makeup. This is what people report. Even people I've known naively have had these experiences and then were astonished to discover, oh no, that happens quite a lot. And then there are other kind of perhaps archetypal DMT motifs as well that recur. So why is it, how do we kind of understand this from a reductionist point of view? Why should so many people seemingly independently have an encounter with a kind of giant praying mantis doing kind of brain surgery on them? Is there some kind of, node in the brain which is triggered by DMT, which is specifically designed to induce these kinds of experiences? That seems very unlikely. One of the caveats, of course, is though that you can't ever have a completely culturally unmediated experience. There's no such thing. So it's hard to know what kind of cultural influences or baggage or prior knowledge or memes a person brings to an experience like a DMT experience. Perhaps they were vaguely aware of elves. Maybe if they've read some Terence McKenna, for sure they knew about the elves. But some of the other characters are more obscure and still pop up with a high degree of recurrence when you might not necessarily expect that, because there's not so much kind of cultural information out there about them. Ultimately, though, it's impossible to kind of pass the experience from people's cultural influences. So it's very difficult to kind of establish the genuine nature of these things merely from people's experiences alone, even if they do have a high degree of similarity among seemingly independent experiences.
We certainly have dreams where we appear to interact with other intelligences. So, what are the reasons to consider this might be different to that?
Uh, this is a good question, actually. I mean, I think it's something to do with the astonishing nature of it, and the recurrence of particular identities of particular characters. The occurrence of elves, for instance, in dreams is probably fairly evenly distributed or fairly random. The recurrence of elves in DMT experiences is extremely prolific. So that's kind of good question mark there. It's also, people don't tend to wake up from dreams going, "Oh my God, that was more real than this real." So there's another kind of question mark there. And obviously there may be something inherent in DMT which gives rise to that. But I think we should also try and approach this open-mindedly. Is ultimately a largely metaphysical question, but I think there are ways in which we could attempt to approach this empirically as well, although it's not easy to get at.
Yeah.
But I mean, who's to say that dreams aren't also have a degree of their own internal reality too? When people have shared dream experiences or precognitive dreams, which tend to occur more than you would expect by chance alone, then how do we understand these? And we even have kind of lab data to back up with evidence for the genuine existence of dream precognition or telepathy as well, which seems to suggest a kind of extended mind model of consciousness. And so
Yeah.
if we at least have as a working hypothesis the notion of an extended mind, then is it potentially feasible that people are having encounters with other than themselves in these experiences? It's a big open question.
Yeah. Has there been much sort of mainstream research or attempts to explain this phenomenon of encountering intelligent entities? For example, is there any proposed brain-based story for what brings these experiences about? Because, I mean, just like the default mode network has this relatively specialized process for uh, sort of shaping our sense of self, it seems plausible to me that there is like a relatively specialized area in the brain which kind of flicks on when we're dealing with other intelligences, because the moment that there are other intelligences in our vicinity, then we kind of have to shift gears to start anticipating what these other minds might be up to. And so if a psychedelic is disrupting this intelligence identifier or intentionality projecting process, then it could create the perception of other intelligences trying to communicate with us. And since our minds are already in this very open individualist perspective that psychedelics put us into, maybe that is why the apparent messages that are coming from these entities have these very distinct overtones of oneness and connection. And then I realize that doesn't explain some of the weirder experiences, though.
I mean, possibly not. I think it's an interesting point you kind of made there. Perhaps maybe not directly, but it's like if there is a part of the brain which is somehow associated with encounters with other, like communication part of the brain, or identification of faces or other beings or something like that, which is activated during these encounters on DMT. That doesn't necessarily solve the issue, does it? Because, as you said, it could be that if you're having an encounter with some other being, be it, genuinely in the real world or in a DMT experience, you would expect those parts of the brain to be activated. And there is research going on. I'm collaborating with the team at Imperial, primarily Chris Timmerman, who's working with DMT. So we're looking at brain imaging and DMT experiences. But it still becomes either a neurotheological or a theoneurological kind of debate, right? Okay, of course, these parts of the brain are activated when you're having encounters, but is it they're activated because you're having an encounter, or are you having an encounter because this part of the brain is activated? You see, it becomes a bit of a chicken and the egg kind of debate, really. But it's still useful data to kind of determine, okay, so what is actually happening in the brain when these encounter experiences occur. And Chris has just completed his first fMRI scanning of people on DMT and asked them about their entity encounters. So we'll have some data on that soon, or he will at least. But then we're going to collaborate in the next few years, hopefully, on some more kind of exotic questions as well. Ultimately, how you interpret the data really depends on your prior position on what the experiences mean. So yeah, let's see what data we come up with though anyway.
Hi everyone, that was a clip from my conversation with psychologist David Luke on the Waking Cosmos podcast. For new listeners, Waking Cosmos is a philosophical podcast focusing on the mystery of consciousness and the nature of reality. If you want, you can listen to the whole episode on our YouTube channel, Meta Rising, and of course you can now listen to Waking Cosmos on Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, and other places I would imagine too. One last thing, Waking Cosmos is community funded, so if you would like to support the continued existence of this podcast and keep the lights on here at Waking Cosmos, please consider subscribing over on our Patreon page at patreon.com/wakingcosmos. Thank you.